March 14th, 1849, began like any other day in Lowndes County, Alabama, humid, restless, and veiled beneath a pale morning fog that clung to the courthouse square. By noon, that same fog had turned to smoke. When the courthouse burned, it didn't just take the records of the county with it, it devoured the history of an entire generation. Witnesses later said it started in the clerk's office. An overturned oil lamp, perhaps, or a careless gesture with a cigar. But those who were there that day swore the fire moved too quickly, too deliberately, racing along the wooden rafters as if guided by unseen hands. Within minutes, the roof collapsed, sending up a column of black smoke visible for miles across the flat Alabama countryside. By the time the last embers cooled and the crowd gathered to pick through the wreckage, little remained but the courthouse steps and the warped skeleton of its iron vault. Inside that vault, under a layer of soot and debris, investigators found something that should not have been there at all. 3 sets of human remains, each chained to the basement wall. The coroner's report, written in a shaking hand, noted that the bones were arranged in such a manner as to suggest confinement, and that the iron rings securing them were embedded deep in the masonry, predating the courthouse's construction by at least several decades. The official explanation was swift and unconvincing. Vagrants, perhaps, or prisoners held during renovation work. Yet the county clerk's entire archive, deeds, birth records, probate files, was gone, burned to ash. And among the missing were the papers of the Sutton estate, one of the largest and oldest plantations in the region. In the months that followed, rumors began to spread. Old names resurfaced in whispers: Bell River, the Sutton twins, the slave named Marcus. No one spoke of them publicly. Not in Lowndes County, not in Hanville, not anywhere in the South where land and lineage still held sacred weight. But in private letters, in the testimonies collected years later by Northern abolitionist societies, the same story emerged again and again, a story that began not with the fire, but with a funeral 2 years earlier. Lowndes County in 1847 was a kingdom carved from black soil and white ambition. The Alabama River curved like a serpent through fields of cotton so thick and luminous they looked like frost from a distance. Planters built their fortunes here brick by brick, lash by lash. The wealth that flowed through Hanville, the county seat, was measured not in coin, but in the number of enslaved souls one could command. At the center of this world stood Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, a man both admired and feared. He was the kind of Southern patriarch the century would later mythologize, learned, articulate, steeped in the rhetoric of science and destiny. He'd fought under Andrew Jackson in the Creek War, returned to Alabama with a commission, and built Bell River Plantation on a rise 8 miles south of Hanville. The house was a monument to precision: 12 rooms, 3 stories, white columns facing east toward the dawn. Behind it stretched 2 rows of slave cabins, 24 in all, spaced with mathematical symmetry. Beyond them, the fields, cotton, indigo, and sorghum, shimmered in the sun like the spoils of a private empire. The colonel's neighbors called him eccentric. His library contained volumes from Philadelphia and London, anatomical treatises, agricultural journals, and thick notebooks filled with his own cramped handwriting. He believed, as he once told a visiting professor, that the progress of civilization rests upon the deliberate improvement of the human species. What he meant by improvement depended on who was listening, but those who worked his land understood perfectly. He kept ledgers not just of production, but of people: weights, heights, measurements of skull and limb, notes on temperament, fertility, obedience. He viewed his slaves as data points in a grotesque experiment, a living catalogue of what he called applied anthropology. But there was one part of his life he never recorded publicly: Ruth, a woman he purchased in Charleston in 1824, described in the bill of sale as of unusually fair complexion and refined demeanor. She gave birth to twin daughters a year later, Sarah and Catherine. He educated them like ladies, but owned them like livestock. He dressed them in imported silk and taught them Latin verbs. yet their names appeared on the property rolls alongside horses and plows. They grew up in the main house, surrounded by books, mirrors, and silence. The colonel forbade them from leaving Bell River without his permission. Visitors who met the twins spoke of their beauty, their eerie composure, and the way they seemed to communicate without words. After their mother's death in 1839, officially pneumonia, though whispers in the quarters said otherwise, the colonel's control grew absolute. He locked their doors at night. He made them write weekly reports of their conduct, their dreams, their desires. He tested them constantly, leaving jewels within reach, introducing them to suitors only to withdraw them at the last moment. Like a scientist studying reaction and restraint, by the mid-1840s, Bell River was thriving. The colonel owned 63 enslaved people, producing more than 100 bales of cotton a year. But beneath the smooth surface of prosperity ran a current of unease. The slaves whispered about the colonel's experiments, about cabins where women disappeared for weeks, about the overseer Jonas Pritchett, who recorded births and punishments in ledgers as precise as the colonel's own. Pritchett was a man without imagination, which made him dangerous. He enforced the colonel's will without question, flogged men for the slightest disobedience, and noted the results as if documenting weather patterns. The twins learned to avoid him, though they watched and remembered. They read their father's journals when he traveled, creeping into his study by candlelight. They learned what he believed, that humanity could be perfected through selective breeding, that certain traits could be cultivated or erased. They read entries that described not theories, but acts. Female number 7 resistant to pairing. Increase isolation. Observe outcome. The twins understood then what their father had made of them, not daughters but specimens. And quietly in their matching rooms, with their matching dresses, they began to hate him. February 3rd, 1847, dawned unusually warm. The mist over Bell River clung low, heavy with the smell of rain and soil. The colonel had worked late the previous night, as he often did, surrounded by books and the faint odor of lamp oil. By morning, he was dead. It was Pritchett who found him slumped in his chair, papers scattered, a half-finished letter to his attorney on the desk. "Heart seizure," declared Dr. Amos Grayfield of Hanville after a glance at the body. Overwork, stress, and the temper of his constitution. Nothing unusual, but there were details that didn't fit. The untouched dinner tray, the coffee cup with strange crystalline residue at the bottom. The unfinished sentence in his final letter, "I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters, which must be executed precisely as stipulated, for their protection and the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to—" The line trailed off into a blot of ink. Sarah and Catherine stood in the hallway when the doctor announced the cause of death. They wore identical black dresses that fit perfectly, though no seamstress in Hanville had been summoned. Their faces were calm, almost serene. "We'll handle the funeral arrangements," Sarah said. Grayfield frowned. "You're very composed, Miss Sutton." "Our father valued composure," Catherine replied. "The funeral was held 3 days later under grey skies. The county's finest attended, planters, merchants, even the sheriff. Reverend Yates delivered a eulogy that praised the colonel's devotion to the advancement of human knowledge. No one mentioned the rumors, or the whispers, or the quiet terror that hung over Bell River's fields. When the coffin was lowered into the family plot, the twins stood side by side, their gloved hands intertwined. Neither shed a tear. That night, in the silence of the empty house, Sarah whispered to her sister, "It's over." Catherine shook her head. "No, it's only beginning." 2 days later, the attorney from Mobile arrived, Jeremiah Osgood, portly, silver-haired and sweating through his collar. He brought with him a sealed will and a private letter addressed to the twins. The will was read in the colonel's study, the air still thick with the ghost of his pipe smoke. "To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton," Osgood began, "I leave the entirety of Bell River Plantation, lands, structures, livestock and human property to be held jointly and equally, on condition that within 24 months of my death, both daughters enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing, approved by the executors of this estate, and that both produce legitimate offspring within said period." A hush fell over the room. Even the clock seemed to pause. "If the conditions are not met," Osgood continued, "Bell River shall be sold, and the proceeds divided among the charitable institutions specified herein." Sarah's voice, when it came, was steady. "And who are the executors?" "Myself," said Osgood, "and Mr. Harold Breenridge of Hanville." Catherine smiled without warmth. "So our fates are in the hands of men our father trusted most." Osgood hesitated. "There is also a personal letter." He handed it to them. Sarah broke the seal, and together they read their father's final words, the handwriting neat, deliberate, and merciless. He accused them of weakness. He called their bond unnatural. He wrote that they would never make proper wives, never understand duty, never continue his work unless forced by necessity, and he ended with a single chilling line. "You are what I made you. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison." When Sarah folded the letter, her hands trembled only once. "He thinks he can control us from the grave," Catherine said. Sarah looked toward the window, where the cotton fields stretched pale beneath the afternoon sun. "Then let's prove him wrong." That night, they entered the study again. On the desk lay their father's journal, still open to his last entry. Catherine touched the spine with careful fingers. "Everything he believed is here." "Yes," Sarah said, "and everything he feared." From the shadows beyond the window, unseen, the overseer Jonas Pritchett watched the lamplight flicker across their faces. He would later tell a neighbor that the sisters looked like two reflections in a dark mirror. He didn't know it then, but the clock in that room had already begun to count down, not to the marriage their father demanded, but to the fire that would erase them all. The morning after Colonel Sutton's funeral, Bell River Plantation woke beneath a strange stillness. The mourning ribbons still hung from the veranda rails, and the great bell that called the field hands to work remained silent until nearly noon. No one knew whether to begin the day or to wait for orders. In life, the colonel's voice had filled every inch of the plantation. In death, his absence felt like an open wound. Sarah and Catherine moved through the house as if nothing had changed. They breakfasted in the dining room, each in her customary place, the same delicate cups of tea their father had preferred, the same restrained conversation. But behind the calm there was a hum of calculation, a new rhythm taking shape. In the quarters, the enslaved people spoke in low voices, trading guesses about what would happen now. Would the estate be sold? Would they be split and sent away? The memory of the colonel's rules still burned in every mind. The sudden punishments, the secret pairings, the records written in his tight, precise hand. Most had not dared hope for freedom, only for less cruelty. When the overseer Jonas Pritchett approached the quarters that morning, he found a group already waiting for him. They stood with eyes lowered, a silent demand in their posture. "Your work continues as before," he said. "No changes. The Mrs. Sutton have assumed command. You'll do as they say, same as you did with the colonel." The words rippled through the cabins like a cold wind. Few believed them. The twins had always been distant figures, rarely seen beyond the veranda. Yet now their power was absolute. That afternoon, Sarah summoned Pritchett to the study, the same room where their father had died. The air still smelled faintly of coffee and burnt oil. She stood behind the colonel's desk, hands resting lightly on the wood. Catherine sat in the corner by the window, a ledger open on her knees. "We'll be taking control of operations," Sarah said. "You'll continue your duties as overseer, but all accounts and purchase orders come directly to us." Pritchett shifted uncomfortably. Miss Sarah, I've handled the accounts for 15 years. Your father, my father is dead, she interrupted. Her voice carried the soft precision of a knife sliding into cloth. You'll address all business to me or my sister. No decisions are made without our approval. Catherine closed the ledger and looked up. You may go now, Mr. Pritchett. There's work to be done. He hesitated, caught between obedience and disbelief, then nodded and left, his boots echoing down the hall. When the door closed, Sarah exhaled slowly. He'll test us. Let him, Catherine replied. We'll learn how deep his loyalty runs. They were not wrong. Within days, rumours reached them, whispers that Pritchett had been in town, complaining to other planters that the Sutton girls had lost their minds, that they intended to run the plantation themselves without a man to guide them. The idea was so absurd to local society that it spread like wildfire. Sarah and Catherine responded the way their father would have, with documentation. They recorded every transaction, every expense, every bale of cotton shipped, and they did it flawlessly. Within a month, Bell River was operating more efficiently than it had in years, but efficiency was only a surface layer. Beneath it, the twins began a second operation, one their father could never have imagined. They started with his journals. The Colonel had kept everything. Decades of notes, breeding logs, medical experiments, measurements of infants, observations on behavior. Each entry numbered, cross-referenced, categorized. The more they read, the clearer it became that their father had viewed Bell River not as a home, but as a laboratory. Some pages described forced pairings in the quarters, women chosen for their compliance, men for their strength. Other pages listed punishments for those who resisted, and interspersed among the data were the Colonel's reflections, cold, academic, horrifying. Female number 12 shows undesirable resistance, punishment administered to correct temperament. Subject produced a male child of notable complexion. Recommend further observation. Sarah read in silence until her hands began to shake. Catherine turned the pages more quickly, forcing herself through them as if speed could dull their impact. He wrote about them like they were animals, Sarah whispered. Worse, Catherine said. He wrote about them like they were numbers. For 3 nights they sat in that study, reading. The lamplight turned their faces hollow, their eyes sunken. By dawn of the 4th day, they had reached the end. A final entry dated only a week before the Colonel's death. Progress satisfactory. Twin subjects exhibit increasing independence, though their attachment remains excessive. Continued isolation may reduce empathy and encourage desired detachment. The experiment nears completion. Catherine's voice broke the silence. We were the experiment. Sarah closed the journal. Not anymore. In the following weeks, they began to alter the rhythm of Bell River. Small changes at first. They ordered the workday to start an hour later, citing the early frost. They allowed longer breaks in the fields, better food, proper shoes. Pritchett protested. Of course. You'll spoil them, he warned. Sarah ignored him. We're maintaining productivity. That's what the will requires. But privately she told Catherine, if the plantation must continue, then at least it will not continue as his prison. Not all of their changes were born of kindness. Some were strategy. They knew the conditions of the will. Marriage and legitimate heirs within 2 years would trap them unless they acted carefully. They studied their father's correspondences with scientists and planters across the South, noting names, attitudes, and prejudices. Among the papers, they found one name repeated with unusual frequency. Marcus, described only as literate, reliable, acquired from Granville Estate. The Colonel had noted his intelligence and his capacity for instruction. The last entry beside his name read, Potential for advancement. To be observed. At the time, the twins thought nothing of it. Marcus was just one of dozens of names in their father's experiments, but by spring, that name would return to them in the most unexpected way. March faded into April. bringing with it a festival. Atmosphere in Hanville, the annual cotton auction, when buyers, planters and traders filled the courthouse square. Sarah and Catherine attended for the first time, veiled in mourning black that allowed them to observe unseen. They had come to purchase new field workers, or so they claimed. In truth, they wanted to learn what kind of men moved in their father's world, men they might one day have to marry, manipulate or destroy. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell like a chant. One by one, people were brought to the block. Children, mothers, whole families torn apart while white men discussed the weather. Sarah felt the bile rise in her throat but kept her composure. Catherine's hands clenched inside her gloves until her nails cut the skin. Then, shortly before noon, the auctioneer announced the next lot. One male, age 28, name of Marcus, property of the late Granville estate, literate, worked as a house servant and tutor, no record of disobedience. Sarah looked up sharply. The man on the platform stood straight, not defiant but aware. His expression was unreadable, his gaze level. He looked like someone accustomed to thinking, not merely obeying. An educated slave, a planter scoffed. That's trouble waiting to happen. Trouble, Sarah murmured, is exactly what we need. Before Catherine could reply, she nodded to Pritchett. Bid. The price climbed higher than expected. 1,000, 1,200, 1,600. The crowd murmured when Pritchett won the final bid. By evening, Bell River had a new arrival. Marcus was brought to the main house the next day. He carried nothing but a small satchel and the quiet dignity of a man who had survived too much to fear humiliation. Sarah waited for him in the study. Catherine stood by the fireplace. The conversation was brief, almost formal. "You can read and write," Sarah said. "Yes, ma'am. You tutored the Granville children." "I did. And now you're here." Marcus met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Catherine studied him. "The Granvilles were Quakers, weren't they?" He hesitated. "They were. They allowed you education. They believed knowledge was not a privilege," he said carefully. "They believed it was a right." "And what do you believe?" Sarah asked. "I believe I've just been sold to two women who don't yet know what to do with me." Silence followed, the kind that stretched, electric and dangerous. Then Sarah smiled faintly. "You may be right, Mr. Marcus, but you'll learn quickly. We value intelligence here." He inclined his head. "Then I suppose I'll survive." In the weeks that followed, Marcus was assigned to manage household accounts, a task the twins pretended was practical, but which served another purpose entirely. It allowed him unrestricted access to the Colonel's papers, and it allowed them to observe him. He worked quietly, methodically, with an economy of motion that suggested deep patience. He asked few questions, though he noticed everything. The twin sisters' uncanny synchronization, the strange combination of discipline and secrecy that ruled the house. At night, after the candles were extinguished, he sometimes heard footsteps pacing the hall, whispers behind closed doors, the faint sound of piano music drifting from the parlor long after midnight. One evening, while sorting the Colonel's ledgers, Marcus came across a document written in cipher. He recognized it immediately, not the code itself, but the style. The Granvilles had used similar ciphers to record testimony from enslaved people for abolitionist networks. He hid the paper before anyone noticed. By June, the heat returned to Alabama, thick and suffocating. The air at Bell River shimmered above the fields. The twins rarely left the house except to oversee the harvest. Their mourning clothes had given way to pale dresses that clung to their skin. One night, Catherine joined Marcus in the study as he worked. "Do you know why we bought you?" she asked suddenly. Marcus didn't look up. "Because you needed a clerk," she smiled. "No, because you needed a witness." He glanced at her then, uncertain. "My sister thinks of you as a tool," she said softly. I think of you as insurance. If the world ever questions what happens here, you'll be the one to write it down." "Would you want the world to know?" he asked. Catherine's expression hardened. "Only if it burns everything else to ash." She turned and left, the door closing behind her with a whisper. That night, Marcus began keeping his own records. He wrote in the margins of the colonel's old books, in the hidden pages of ledgers, using a code of his own design. He documented everything, the routines, the changes, the strange rituals of the twin sisters who ruled Bell River. What he didn't know, couldn't yet know, was that his chronicle would one day outlast them all. For now, the plantation still breathed, still obeyed, still pretended to function like any other in the Alabama countryside. But beneath the quiet, a fuse had been lit, invisible, patient, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And when it did, Lowndes County would remember the name Bell River, not for its cotton or its columns, but for the horror that had been growing in its heart all along. There were no candles lit, only the moonlight spilling through the shutters. She approached him without hesitation, without tenderness. The act itself was mechanical, stripped of emotion, a ritual of survival. When it was over, she sat with her back to him, her voice hollow. "My father did this to women 100 times. He called it improvement. I'd call it revenge." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. By November, Sarah was pregnant. Dr. Grayfield confirmed it with the same indifference he applied to every matter at Bell River. The executors were pleased. The first condition of the will was nearly met. Catherine's engagement to Varley faltered when the old man fell ill and died unexpectedly. His family reclaimed what remained of his estate, and Catherine was left without a husband. "Time was running out. We have 14 months left," she said, pacing the study. "If I don't marry soon, we lose everything." Sarah, pale and exhausted, watched her from the sofa. "Then find someone who can die quickly." Catherine stopped. I mean that our father killed dozens with his experiments. If death can serve science, it can serve justice." The words hung in the air. "Poisonous and tempting," Catherine whispered. "Perhaps I already have someone in mind." That winter, a new visitor arrived at Bell River, Lawrence Kemper, a schoolteacher turned small planter from Wilcox County. He was a widower, polite, gentle, and terminally ill with consumption. He came to Bell River to sell lumber and left with an invitation to return. When Catherine met him again, she saw in his trembling hands and hollow eyes exactly what she needed, a dying man who would never live long enough to ask questions. "Do you believe in providence, Mr. Kemper?" she asked softly. "I believe in mercy," he said. "Even when we don't deserve it," Catherine smiled. "Then perhaps you and I will understand each other perfectly." By the end of the year, 2 weddings were being planned. Sarah's to Thomas Breenridge, Catherine's to Lawrence Kemper. The executors congratulated themselves on their success. They could not know that Bell River was already doomed, that within 24 months, every document bearing the Sutton name would burn. Every secret buried beneath the courthouse would claw its way back to the surface. For now, the twins played their parts flawlessly, the grieving daughters, the dutiful wives-to-be. But behind their composure, the old house pulsed with something unholy. Love twisted into defiance, defiance sharpened into survival. And Marcus, the silent witness, continued to write. He recorded everything, the births, the lies, the quiet acts of rebellion, knowing that one day truth itself might be the only weapon left. The summer of 1847 pressed down on Lowndes County like a fever. The fields shimmered under a pale, merciless sun, and the air at Bell River carried the faint metallic scent of heat and memory, the ghost of the colonel still breathing through every corridor. Sarah and Catherine ruled the estate with quiet precision. To outsiders, it appeared miraculous. 2 young women managing a plantation as efficiently as any man. But inside the walls of Bell River, the sisters lived in a state of constant, humming tension, half fear, half exhilaration. Every morning, they walked the fields together, identical in posture, their parasols casting twin shadows. They spoke little. Sometimes Catherine hummed a hymn their mother used to sing. Sometimes Sarah whispered numbers, calculating yields and shipments. They were no longer daughters mourning a father. They were generals preserving an empire, one they secretly despised. The county accepted their leadership reluctantly. The men of Hanville whispered that the Sutton twins were unnatural, that their father's intellect had turned to witchcraft in their blood. But none dared challenge them openly, for Bell River remained prosperous, and prosperity silenced suspicion. The only man who dared speak to them with candor was Marcus. He had been at Bell River nearly 3 months when Sarah summoned him one evening to the veranda. The sun was setting over the fields, painting the horizon in molten gold. She gestured for him to sit, a courtesy no slave expected, and therefore one that carried the weight of intention. "You've seen how things are here," she began. "You've read my father's records. You understand the situation." Marcus nodded. "I understand that you've inherited a kingdom built on torment." She studied him, her eyes unreadable. "And yet you remain." "I remain because I have no choice," he said simply. "You always have a choice," Sarah replied. "Even when it's between damnation and death." He smiled faintly, spoken like someone who's never faced either. The exchange hung between them, like the air before a storm. Then she said quietly, "We need your help, Marcus. And if you agree, I can give you what my father never would." He frowned. "And what's that?" "Freedom." That night, for the first time, the twins told Marcus everything. They spoke of their father's will, the demand that both must marry within 2 years, produce legitimate children, and maintain the plantation's success. They explained how failure meant the estate would be sold, and their father's fortune dispersed among the same institutions that had fueled his monstrous experiments. "It's a trap," Catherine said. "He built a cage so perfect that even dead, he still holds the key." Marcus listened in silence. The candlelight caught the curve of Sarah's jaw, the tension in Catherine's hands. They looked like women carved from the same grief. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Sarah leaned forward. "We want to survive. And to do that, we need heirs. Children who will secure this inheritance. Children who will end the Sutton line as our father intended it, and begin something entirely different." He stared at her, uncomprehending at first. Then the meaning settled like a stone in his gut. "You're asking me to father them," he said slowly. Catherine's expression didn't waver. "Yes." Marcus rose abruptly. "That's madness." "If anyone discovered, no one will," Sarah interrupted. "We control this plantation. We control the records. We will marry men of suitable standing, as the will requires. Men old enough, desperate enough, or foolish enough to accept whatever terms we dictate. You will be the father in secret. They will be the fathers on paper." Marcus felt the ground tilt beneath him. "You're asking me to risk my life for your scheme." "For an illusion," Sarah's tone hardened. "For your freedom." He left that night without answering, walking into the fields where the cicadas screamed like restless ghosts. The air smelled of cotton and decay. Above him, the stars were sharp as glass. He thought of the Granvilles, the Quaker family who had once owned him, who had taught him letters and scripture, who had believed they could change the world with faith alone. They were dead now, taken by fever, and their estate sold to men like Sutton. He thought of the journals hidden in the colonel's study, the proof of what had been done to generations of people, reduced to numbers in ink. He thought of what might happen if those records ever reached the north. By dawn, Marcus returned to the house. Sarah and Catherine were waiting in the parlor, dressed in pale morning gowns, their hair unbound for the first time he had ever seen. "I'll do it," he said. Catherine smiled faintly. "We knew you would, but on one condition," he added. "If I'm to risk everything, I want access to your father's archives, all of them." "I want to read every line," Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed. You study them here under our eyes. Nothing leaves this house." "Fair enough," Marcus said. "You want control. I want truth. We'll see who learns more from the other." That arrangement began a strange and terrible intimacy. By day, Marcus worked as their secretary, managing correspondence and crop accounts. By night, He studied the colonel's journals under the sisters' supervision. Sometimes Sarah read aloud, her voice steady as she spoke her father's cruelties into the air. Sometimes Catherine paced the room, whispering corrections under her breath. The real names behind the numbers. The people they had known as children, but never been allowed to call family. Through these nights, the line between master and subject began to blur. Marcus found himself speaking freely, questioning them about their motives, their fears, the world beyond Bell River. "You hate your father," he said once. "But you still live by his methods." Sarah's eyes flashed. "We live because of his methods. We'll die without them." "Then you've already lost." She didn't answer. By August, the twins had begun searching for suitable husbands. The task proved as delicate as surgery. Catherine drew up a list of local men, wealthy enough to satisfy the executors, but pliable enough to be controlled. Their first choice was Edmund Varley, a widower of 68, whose fortune had dwindled with age. He visited Bell River one humid afternoon, escorted by his son and coughing into a linen handkerchief. "My late friend the colonel spoke of you often," Varley said, his eyes lingering on Catherine. "A marriage between our families would be most advantageous." Catherine smiled politely. "I'm sure it would, Mr. Varley, though you should know that we value partnership above advantage." Varley laughed, not understanding that the woman before him was measuring his weakness with the precision of a scientist. By the time he left, Catherine already knew how to manipulate him. "He'll do," she told Sarah later. "He's vain, frail, and desperate." The perfect husband. Sarah said nothing. Her own prospects were less certain. The executors, particularly Harold Greenridge, were already interfering, insisting she consider his nephew Thomas, a man of sound moral character and respectable means. Thomas Greenridge was 34, handsome enough and utterly unremarkable. He smiled too easily, drank too much, and spoke of himself with the self-assurance of a man who'd never been told no. Sarah recognized him immediately for what he was, a pawn. "He'll think he's controlling me," she told Catherine. "That's what makes him useful." Meanwhile, Marcus continued his secret work. Each night, after the twins retired, he copied the most damning passages from the colonel's records onto thin sheets of paper, writing in a cipher of his own invention. He hid the pages in a hollowed-out Bible under his cot. He also began to notice patterns in the plantation's health records, clusters of illnesses among the women in the quarters. Fever, lesions, miscarriages, symptoms the colonel had noted but never explained. One evening, Marcus confronted Sarah with his discovery. "Your father infected them," he said. "Deliberately. I found his notes. He called it a controlled exposure to venereal contagion, to test immunity between bloodlines." Sarah's face went pale. "You're certain?" "I've read the evidence." Catherine entered the room, eyes widening as Marcus laid the pages before them. "He did this to them, to their children, and called it science." For a long moment none of them spoke. Then Sarah said quietly, "We'll treat them." Marcus blinked. "How?" "We'll bring a doctor from Hanville. We'll buy the medicine, whatever it costs. If they die, it will not be by our hands." That night marked the first act of mercy Bell River had seen in decades. Dr. Grayfield returned reluctantly, examined the sick, and prescribed mercury treatments with the detached air of a man tending livestock. The cost was ruinous. Productivity plummeted. The twins didn't care. "Our father made this place a laboratory," Sarah said. "We'll make it human again." For Marcus, it was the first time he saw them as something more than reflections of their father's cruelty. They were broken instruments, trying to make music from the fragments. Autumn crept in. The fields turned gold, and the twins' scheme advanced. By October, Catherine's engagement to Varley was nearly secured, while Sarah prepared to accept Thomas Greenridge's proposal. The executors congratulated themselves on restoring order to the Sutton line. But inside the house, the sisters were preparing for something far darker. Sarah came to Marcus late one night, her voice calm, but her eyes feverish. "It's time." He knew what she meant. The winter of 1847 settled over Bell River like a thin layer of frost. cold enough to silence the earth, not cold enough to kill what grew beneath it. Beneath the stillness, the plantation pulsed with concealed motion, the sound of hammers preparing for weddings, of servants whispering about silk dresses, of secrets being measured and fitted like fabric on a hidden loom. Sarah's belly had begun to swell, the faint curve visible beneath her mourning gown. She claimed exhaustion and stayed mostly indoors, dictating letters and studying ledgers while pretending to prepare for her marriage to Thomas Breenridge. He was due to arrive in December for the ceremony. The executors were delighted. Enville society less so. Two young women, twin heirs of a fortune, marrying men twice their age, one sickly, one indebted, stirred the appetite of gossip like blood in water. But no rumor, no idle tongue, could have imagined the true arrangement unfolding behind the shuttered windows of Bell River. Catherine's betrothal to Lawrence Kemper was quieter and stranger. He arrived in a carriage drawn by two thin horses, his cough announcing him before his name did. A pale man with kind eyes and trembling hands, he seemed more ghost than suitor. His illness had hollowed him out. Each breath was a measured act of endurance. "I should warn you," he said on their first walk along the veranda, "I haven't long. The doctors give me a year, perhaps less. Then we understand each other," Catherine replied gently. "Neither of us believes in forever." He blinked, uncertain whether she spoke of faith or of time. In truth, Catherine believed in neither. December 15th, 1847, the day of Sarah's wedding, dawned clear and cold. The air smelled of cedar and smoke. Bell River was transformed. Garlands hung from the columns, white ribbons fluttered against the winter wind, and the parlor had been converted into a chapel. The guests arrived in carriages dusted with frost. They whispered behind gloved hands, speculating about the mysterious sisters who had managed to hold the estate without male guardianship for nearly a year. When Sarah appeared at the top of the staircase, silence fell. She wore ivory silk, her dark hair braided in the old style, a silver cross resting against her collarbone. Her expression was calm, distant, radiant in a way that frightened more than charmed. Thomas Breenridge, waiting at the altar, swayed slightly from nerves and whiskey. His smile was too wide, his hands too damp. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. Reverend Yates spoke of duty, legacy, and divine union. Sarah's voice never trembled. When the vows were spoken and the kiss performed, the guests applauded politely, unaware that what they had witnessed was a performance, a ritual of deception executed with the precision of surgery. That night, when the guests had departed and the house had gone quiet, Sarah entered the study where Marcus waited. The room was lit only by the fire. She still wore her wedding dress, her veil discarded on the floor. "It's done," she said. Marcus stood, uncertain. He expects what I tell him to expect," she interrupted. "Thomas Breenridge will have his comfort, his income, and his illusions. But the life of this house and the child it bears belong to me." She crossed to him, her movements neither shy nor tender. "My father made this place a breeding ground," she said. "He believed blood determined destiny. I intend to prove him wrong. What followed was not love, nor lust, but a ritual of survival, deliberate, cold, and terrible in its purpose." When it was over, Sarah sat on the floor beside the dying fire, staring into the embers. "He would call this heresy," she said softly. Marcus met her gaze. "He would call it progress." For the next several weeks, Bell River lived in uneasy calm. The new Mr. Breenridge settled into the role of gentleman proprietor, spending most of his days hunting or drinking in town. Sarah managed the plantation as before, but now under the illusion of masculine authority. Catherine's turn came in January 1848. Her wedding to Lawrence Kemper was smaller, attended only by close neighbors and the executors. The ceremony was held in the drawing room, the air thick with the scent of laudanum from Kemper's medicine. When he vowed to love and cherish her, his voice broke into a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his glove. Catherine did not flinch. The union was brief. Kemper's health declined rapidly after the wedding. By February, he was confined to bed, reading scripture with trembling hands, while Catherine oversaw his meals and his medicine. Her care was flawless, tender even, and yet everyone who looked at her saw the same thing, a widow waiting for the clock to finish its work. Marcus watched all of this with growing unease. He had believed, once, that he understood the sisters, that their cruelty was born of desperation, their manipulation of necessity. But as the months passed, he saw something else taking root in them, a coldness that no longer came from fear, but from control. One evening, while checking the household accounts, he overheard them arguing in the study. "You said you wouldn't touch him," Sarah hissed. "He's dying anyway," Catherine replied. "Faster is mercy. It's murder. It's strategy." Marcus stepped into the doorway. "You're both wrong," he said quietly. They turned, startled. "If you kill him," he continued, "you'll lose everything you claim to be fighting for. Once blood is on your hands, you'll never wash it away." Catherine's eyes were cold. "And you think yours are clean?" He didn't answer. There was no answer. By March, both twins were pregnant. The executors visited to verify the conditions of the will. They found 2 respectable marriages, 2 expectant wives, and a plantation thriving under efficient management. Harold Greenridge declared himself satisfied. For a brief time, the house knew something almost like peace. Then the fever came. It began in the quarters, a rash of illness that spread through the cabins like fire through dry grass. Dozens fell sick. Dr. Grayfield was summoned again, but his remedies did little. Marcus recognized the symptoms immediately. "Your father's disease," he told Sarah. "Syphilis. It's spreading again." She stared at him, horrified. "How? We treated them." "Not all. Some cases were hidden. Some carried it unknowingly. It's too late for prevention now." Catherine entered, her face drawn. "Then what do we do?" "We contain it," Marcus said. "We isolate the sick, burn what can't be cleaned, and pray it doesn't reach the children." The twins obeyed. They ordered new linens, destroyed contaminated clothing, and turned one of the barns into a makeshift infirmary. The cost was ruinous. The community whispered that the Sutton sisters were cursed. By summer, the fever had burned itself out, leaving graves behind the cotton fields. The sisters attended none of the burials, but each night Sarah stood on the veranda, watching the horizon as if waiting for judgment. Lawrence Kemper died in August. He passed in his sleep, a Bible open on his chest, his last words a whispered apology to someone who wasn't in the room. Catherine wept once, a single soundless sob, then ordered the servants to prepare the body for burial. "He was kind," Marcus said later. "He was weak," Catherine replied. "And the world is not kind to weakness." She looked at Marcus then, and for the first time he saw the depth of her exhaustion, the toll of living as both victim and executioner. "I envy him," she said. "He's free." Autumn came, heavy with rain. The cotton harvest was smaller than usual, but still enough to satisfy the executors. The sisters' bellies grew round, their movements slower. The house smelled of herbs and boiling linens, of anticipation and dread. One evening, while lightning flickered on the horizon, Sarah found Marcus in the library. "When this is over," she said, "when the children are born and the estate is ours, I'll keep my promise." "You'll have your freedom," he nodded. "And what about you?" She looked around the room, the books, the ledgers, the polished instruments of her father's intellect. "I don't know if I can be free," she said. "I don't know what that means anymore." Sarah gave birth first, on November 15th, 1848, after 18 hours of labor. The child was a girl, small but strong, with skin the color of bronze and eyes that mirrored her mother's. "A girl," the midwife announced. Sarah reached for the child, tears cutting lines down her face. "Her name is Abigail," she whispered. "After the grandmother our father never spoke of." Catherine delivered 3 weeks later. Her labor was longer, bloodier. The child emerged limp and silent, until the midwife struck her feet and drew a cry. "Another girl," the woman said. Catherine cradled her, whispering, "Ruth, after our mother." The twins lay in adjoining rooms, each holding her daughter. The air smelled of milk and candle smoke. For the first time in their lives, they looked at something untainted by control. "They'll be free," Sarah murmured. Catherine nodded. "They must be." The executors came 2 weeks later to verify the final conditions of the will. They saw 2 mothers, 2 infants, 2 thriving marriages, at least on paper. "Everything appears in order," Harold Greenridge said. "The Sutton estate passes fully to you both." As he signed the final documents, Sarah felt a strange hollowness. Victory, she realized, was indistinguishable from loss. That night, she burned her father's last journal in the fireplace. The pages curled and blackened, the ink twisting into smoke. Marcus entered quietly, holding both infants. "They're asleep," he said. "Then it's done," she whispered. He looked at her, this woman who had enslaved him and freed him, used him and trusted him. "What will you do now?" "End what he began," she said, "and bury what can't be saved." By the time spring came, preparations were already underway. The papers of manumission had been written, the hidden ledgers copied and sealed. Marcus would leave soon, carrying with him the truth of Bell River. The plantation still stood, serene beneath the Alabama sun. The cotton would grow again, and the people would whisper that the curse of the Suttons had passed. But beneath the veneer of order, something irreversible had taken root, a quiet revolution, written not in ink or law but in blood, birth, and the will to survive. Bell River had always been a house of experiments, but now, for the first time, it had produced something truly new, not obedience, not domination, but the faint, fragile outline of freedom. The spring of 1849 arrived with deceptive gentleness. The riverbanks bloomed with dogwood, and the air smelled of wet soil and renewal. But within the walls of Bell River, the calm was only an illusion, the quiet heartbeat before collapse. The sisters had achieved what the world said was impossible. The will had been fulfilled. The estate was legally theirs. 2 marriages recorded, 2 children born, the lineage secured. On paper, it was victory. In truth, it was a wound that would never heal. Sarah walked the veranda each morning, her daughter Abigail nestled against her shoulder. Catherine did the same in the evenings, with little Ruth sleeping in her arms. They moved like mirrors through the house, passing one another but rarely touching, speaking less with each week that passed. Their unity, once seamless, had begun to unravel. Marcus felt it first, the subtle shift in air, the way silence in the house grew heavy and brittle. The women had stopped dining together. Decisions were made separately. Even the children, born only weeks apart, seemed to absorb the tension, crying when placed too near one another. He stayed mostly in the study, finishing the documents for his departure. Sarah had promised him freedom, official manumission papers, a letter of passage, and enough gold to reach Philadelphia. He would leave in April. Every day he told himself it would be soon, but freedom, he had learned, was never a clean transaction. It was bought in pain, measured in risk, and paid for in blood. In late March, a letter arrived from Pennsylvania. The seal bore the mark of the Anti-Slavery Society. Marcus opened it in secret by candlelight. "Your documents have been received and verified. They corroborate multiple testimonies regarding experimental practices in Alabama. Further evidence would strengthen the case for national publication." The words trembled in his hand. The colonel's journals, the breeding ledgers, the letters, all that horror, finally finding a voice beyond the South. When Sarah found him reading the letter the next morning, he expected anger. Instead, she said quietly, "So it begins. You knew?" "I knew you were writing," she replied. "I told Pritchett to intercept correspondence, but I also told him not to destroy any of it. I wanted you to succeed." "Why?" "Because my father's name deserves the ruin you're giving it." She looked toward the window, where the sun filtered through lace curtains, and added softly, "But when you tell the story, Marcus, tell it true. Don't make monsters out of us. We already did that ourselves." The next week, tragedy returned to Bell River in the shape of a man. Harold Greenridge rode up the drive with the sheriff beside him. His expression was polite, but his purpose was not. "We've received troubling reports," he said, stepping into the parlor. "A freedman from this property, traveling north, carrying documents he had no right to possess." You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Sarah stood beside the mantel, her face unreadable. Mr. Marcus was manumitted lawfully, she said. He left with our permission and his own papers. Whatever he carries belongs to him. Your father's journals belong to this estate, Greenridge snapped. They contain valuable research. They contain proof of atrocities, she interrupted. If you want them, dig for them in his grave. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Greenridge's face flushed red. You're treading dangerous ground, Miss Sutton. Mrs. Greenridge, she corrected. And you're standing in my house. They searched the premises for 3 hours, overturning furniture, rifling through drawers, demanding access to locked rooms. Catherine followed them silently, her daughter in her arms. When the men finally left, finding nothing, Greenridge paused on the veranda. This isn't over, he said. Secrets buried in this soil have a way of clawing back to the surface. Sarah watched him ride away, her expression stone. Then we'll burn the soil itself. That night she told Catherine her plan. We're leaving, she said. We'll sell the property. Use the funds to free who we can. Send the rest north. Then we disappear. Catherine stared at her. And the house? It dies with us. The words struck like a match. Within days, preparations began. Marcus was instructed to finalize the sale. A transfer to a merchant from Mobile who claimed to be sympathetic to abolitionist causes. The sisters arranged the manumission of 8 enslaved people, giving them gold and forged papers. Bell River, once the stage for so much cruelty, became for a few brief weeks a place of quiet redemption. But redemption, like freedom, was fragile. April came early that year, bringing storms that swept across the Alabama plains. The sky was bruised and heavy the night before Marcus's departure. He found Sarah in the study, writing by lamplight. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire burned yet. It's time, he said. She nodded, sealing an envelope. Your papers and more money than I promised. Take it. You'll need it in the north, he hesitated. You don't have to stay, you know. Both of you could come with me, she smiled faintly. And become what? 2 colored women with white children in Philadelphia? We wouldn't last a week. Our lives are here even if they end here. Catherine entered, the infants asleep in her arms. We made this world, Marcus, she said, and we'll unmake it. That's the only freedom left to us. They stood together in silence for a long moment. Then Sarah handed him a small daguerreotype, an image of Marcus holding both girls, taken secretly weeks earlier. So you'll remember them, she said, and they'll know their father wasn't a shadow. Marcus took the photograph with trembling hands. What will you tell them about me? That you told the truth, Catherine said. He left before dawn, walking down the long road toward Hanville as the first rain began to fall. 3 days later, Bell River burned. The fire started in the cellar, or so the official report claimed. An overturned lamp, a burst of wind, a sudden spark. But those who saw it said the blaze rose too fast, consuming the house in an orange roar that painted the sky for miles. By morning, nothing remained but blackened stone and smouldering beams. In the ashes of the study, they found 2 small silver crosses and the twisted frame of a cradle. No bodies were recovered. The local paper called it a tragic accident at one of Alabama's oldest estates. The executors filed insurance claims. The merchant from Mobile vanished, and Lowndes County went back to its slow, deliberate forgetting. Marcus reached Philadelphia safely. He took work as a bookkeeper and continued to send reports to abolitionist groups under a false name. He never remarried. He never returned south. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, he took out the daguerreotype, himself with 2 infants in his arms, and traced their faces with his thumb. He imagined them grown, living somewhere far from Alabama, perhaps believing the world was kind. He didn't know that the girls survived because they did. Neighbors claimed to have seen 2 women leaving Bell River the day before the fire, dressed in black, carrying infants and a single trunk. They boarded a riverboat bound for Mobile under false names and vanished into the Louisiana fog. Months later, a ship manifest listed 2 widows, Mrs. Ann Harper and Mrs. Claire Harper, traveling with 2 infants to New Orleans. From there, the trail went cold until a record appeared in Wisconsin in late 1849. two women purchasing a small farm near Madison, describing themselves as sisters recently widowed by fever. Their children grew up among snow instead of cotton, freedom instead of silence. The past followed them like a shadow, but the shadow thinned with each passing year. In July 1849, the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society published its landmark report on plantation experimentation in the Deep South. It contained excerpts from the journals of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, transcribed from the very documents Marcus had sent. The report caused outrage in the North and fury in the South. Alabama newspapers dismissed it as abolitionist fiction. But historians who studied the report later agreed. The detail was too precise, the records too authentic, the handwriting unmistakable. The name Bell River became a ghost story, told in whispers, the plantation where science met damnation, where a man tried to play God and his daughters set the world on fire to stop him. Years passed. The war came and went. Slavery ended, though its ghosts lingered in the soil. In 1863, Union soldiers searching the ruins of Bell River discovered a sealed iron trunk buried beneath the foundation of the old courthouse in Hanville. Inside were journals, sketches, and ledgers bearing the colonel's name. The contents matched Marcus's testimony almost exactly. Among them was one final entry written in a different hand, the same delicate, looping script found in the twins' letters. He taught us that blood defines worth. We will teach the world that worth is not in blood, but in what one dares to destroy for mercy's sake. Let the fire finish what we began. The signature was simple, S and C Sutton. A century later, when the courthouse in Lowndes County burned again, 3 chained skeletons were found in its basement. No one could explain them. The county clerk's records from 1847 to 1849 had long been missing, destroyed in the first fire. Locals said it was an accident. Historians said it was fate. But those who knew the old stories whispered that the fire was Bell River's final breath, the plantation refusing to rest until its sins were turned to ash. And so the story ends as it began, with fire. Some say Sarah and Catherine died in that blaze, their bones buried beneath the ruins. Others believe they lived quietly in the north, watching their daughters grow in peace. As for Marcus, when he died in 1871, the daguerreotype was found in his desk drawer, 2 women's children in his arms, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. No one could have known how many lives that single secret touched, how many generations carried its invisible scars. But somewhere, in the gray dawns of Alabama, when the mist hangs low over the black soil, people still claim they can smell the faint scent of burned cedar and hear the crying of 2 infants carried by the wind. And if you listen closely, through the hum of cicadas and the rustle of the river oaks, you might still hear a woman's voice, calm, resolute, and unbroken, whispering through the smoke. The blood that flows through our veins is not our prison anymore.